We're at a point where people have been seeing the violence against the Palestinian people every day for 19 months now. And I understand how somebody could reach the breaking point and think that shooting staff from the Israeli embassy is justified. I don't think violence against violence is justified. I don't think it helps the cause. And I think that we are seeing nonviolent action finally have some impact. When you see hundreds of thousands of people who came out in the streets of London over the weekend, and then immediately you see the leaders of the British Parliament and heads of state saying this, what Israel is doing is intolerable, we have to cut off trade relations. That shows that mass mobilization can have an impact. What we in the United States have not done our job at mass mobilization. We should be having millions of people out in the streets. We should be a constant source of opposition that is visible, that has to be covered by the media because it's so big, and has to be listened to by our members of Congress and by the White House because it's so massive. So one thing I think we should take from this act, tragic act by Elias Rodriguez, is to say, let's show that nonviolence can work by upping our game and getting out there by the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions, to show our disgust with what Israel is doing.
The man filming this scene is quoting from the Quran, invoking the apocalypse. Perhaps those below think they're staving it off after nearly 3 months of Israeli blockade. Here at last, a warehouse full of flour. In central Gaza, it belongs to the World Food Programme. The UN workers, he says, simply melted away as the crowd surged in. Multiple reports of injuries and deaths in the melee. It follows yesterday's chaos in the far south at a distribution centre belonging to the controversial US-Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. GHF today called this a brief and intentional relaxation of its security protocols, adding that no Palestinians were fired upon and there were no casualties. But our team witnessed a number of injured people making their way north. The UN says 47 were injured and has today again condemned the GHF operation. Israel has in turn repeated its criticism of the UN, saying it was joining Hamas, mafia-like, in trying to block the GHF. Today, it said it had now given out nearly 15,000 food boxes over 2 days. For all the chaos of this week, to get a sense of Gaza's reality, perhaps better to follow these footsteps. Past rotting debris, beneath circling Israeli drones. They belong to Yara. 10 years old, she's turned provider for her mother and her 7 siblings. This is her destination, an improvised soup kitchen in northern Jabalia. Step back, I want to fill your pots, but you have to move back, he says. Yara is at the back. The stakes are high, but she waits her turn. Yara says these long walks scare her. She's worried about shelling, about being hit by shrapnel out here alone. But she's more worried about her siblings going hungry. Their father is in the West Bank. He went there for medical treatment before the war. He's stuck. His wife and children have no source of income.
بكيف لما أنا أجيب لهم خليهم يأكلوا بدل ما يضلهم جعانين هيك.
The next time we meet her, the family's been forced further south to the streets of Gaza City, clinging on to childhood, to memories she now calls beautiful, eating breakfast, packing a school bag, helping tidy a house long since destroyed.
اختلف كل شيء مع الحرب إلا مع علاقتي مع أمي وأخواتي. بخاطر بحالي بروح أجيب تبكية عشان ما ياكلوا ما يضلهمش هيك.
طيبتها زادت مع الحرب والله، يعني صارت طيبة كتير وبتحزن على قوتها، بتحزن عليهم، فيش أكل وشرب هي بتروح تجيب لهم، يعني بتساعدنا من جميع النواحي. شاطرة يارا.
Yara finished her last school year 2 years ago with top grades. She wants to be a teacher, but this is her job for now. And on this occasion, walking new streets, she's too late. She returns with the pot still empty. She's crushed, says her mother. One more child in Gaza, carrying far more than she can bear.
Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is in Israel as the country marks 600 days since October the 7th, and she joins us now from Hostage Square in Tel Aviv.
Krishnan, of course, there are other victims of this war. 58 hostages, Israeli hostages, taken 600 days ago, and 20 of them, only 20, are believed to still be alive. Behind me in Hostage Square, as it's become known, they're trying to keep them in the public eye, because the people here, relatives and friends and supporters of the hostages, think that their government, the Israeli government, just doesn't care. Earlier in the day, there were protests all around Tel Aviv and in other places too, and they had a simple message for the government: stop fighting, start talking. And it seems that the Americans are paying more attention than the Israelis, because the Americans, they got one of the final American hostage, they got him out through a deal with Hamas, and they are still talking. And in fact, a few hours ago, Steve Witkoff, that's President Trump's envoy, came out and he seemed to be expressing some optimism.
I think that we are on the precipice of sending out a new term sheet that hopefully will be delivered later on today. The president is going to review it, and I have some very good feelings about getting to a long-term resolution, temporary ceasefire, and a long-term resolution, a peaceful resolution of that conflict.
Well, it's not clear where the Israeli government is in all this, because they had stopped negotiating and withdrawn their negotiators from Qatar. And what Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, fears that is if he does negotiate, then his government will fall, because the far right that keeps it going wants to keep fighting. But he needs the support of President Trump and the Americans. You know, earlier this week, I was at a left-wing demonstration where they were protesting against the war, against the killing of Gazan children. And I saw a man in a T-shirt I would never have expected to see in a left-wing demonstration. It said, "In Trump, we trust."
Lindsay Hilsum in Tel Aviv. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Amjad Al-Shawar, the director of the Palestine NGOs network in Gaza, who joined me via the internet from Gaza City. And I asked him to describe what's happening today.
It's a horrible situation with full meaning that we are passing through, that you could see the tens of thousands only in Rafah area, that's not in Gaza City. I'm based in Gaza City, no aid entered. It's about 3 months now, nothing we received in Gaza and the north. These starved people had to walk about 2.5 hours to reach this area for distribution, which not kind of humanitarian hub, it's kind of military hub.
And do you think that's going to work as a system to try and feed the population?
Nothing can replace the humanitarian system that we all have all over the world context. This is something that hurt the humanitarian principle, and in the same time, it's insult the human beings.
And so if you say there's no aid coming to you, I mean, how are you managing? What are you living on?
This kind of suffocation, we are managing to live with only half a meal. I cannot imagine it's a meal. Sometimes we are depending on community kitchens to have some rice, and who managed to buy with about 1,000 times expenses, the things that we are buying if we manage to buy things. So it's a big issue for the Gazans to live here.
There is talk of a possible negotiation around another deal brokered by the Americans. Do you think people want Hamas to do that deal now?
Yes. It's not from today, from the early beginning that we're pushing every actor all over the world to push all Israel and Hamas to reach an agreement.
What if that means Hamas leaving and relinquishing power? Do people want that?
Already, Hamas said that. I'm not the spokesman of Hamas, but already we have this Egyptian plan, it's there. And this approved by all the political parties, that a new governance body will come. So it's a few months ago that it was issued by the Egyptians and it's approved by all the Palestinian actors. The problem is Israel now to approve this and to agree on this.
So what do you think the next step is going to be?
If there will be no ceasefire, I have high concerns that, as Netanyahu said, he will establish concentration camps for the people of Gaza in the south area in Rafah, which almost destroyed now, in order to deport them and to reoccupy Gaza. All of Gaza will be occupied.
We're on the 600th day of this war now. Did you ever imagine this would go on this long?
No, ever. In the worst nightmares, I couldn't imagine this happened to us as Palestinians, to have tens of thousands of people were killed, 90% of Gaza destroyed, and to have such desperate starvation. You know that it's not only Israel. The international community felt the children of Gaza. They witnessed the killing of the children. 17,000 children, infants were killed. Women, elders. The majority of people who were killed and injured, they were civilians.
Amjad Shawa, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I now give the floor to Dr. Feroz Shitwa. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Council. My name is Dr. Feroz Sidwa. I am an American trauma and critical care surgeon based in Stockton, California. I come before you today to speak about the Gaza Strip, where I have volunteered twice since October 7th. First at European Hospital from March 25th to April 8th of last year, and most recently at Nasser Medical Complex from March 6th to April 1st of 2025. Both are in the city of Khan Yunis. I'm not here as a policymaker or a politician. I am a physician bearing witness to the deliberate destruction of a healthcare system, the targeting of my own colleagues, and the erasure of a people. The Constitution of the World Health Organization states that the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent on the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. I've taken this to heart, and it is the reason I volunteer in conflict zones from Haiti to Ukraine to Gaza. In Gaza, I operated in hospitals without sterility, electricity, or anesthetics. Surgeries took place on crowded and filthy floors. Children died not because their injuries were unsurvivable, but because we lacked blood, antibiotics, and the most basic supplies that are readily available in any large hospital anywhere else in the world. I did not see or treat a single combatant during my 5 weeks in Gaza. My patients were 6-year-olds with shrapnels in their heart and bullets in their brains, and pregnant women whose pelvises had been obliterated and their fetuses cut in two while still in the womb. Mothers sheltering in the hospital cooked bread on hot plates in the emergency department during mass casualty events, as we dealt with the rain of fire and death falling around us everywhere. Mr. President, the foundations of life in Gaza, family, health, and community, have been shattered. The medical system has not failed. It has been systematically dismantled through a sustained military campaign that has willfully violated international humanitarian law. Civilians are now dying not just from the constant airstrikes, but from acute malnutrition, sepsis, exposure, and despair. Between my 2 visits to Gaza, I witnessed a sharp decline in patients' health. driven not just by injury, but by worsening hunger and malnutrition that left their bodies weaker, their wounds slower to heal, and their survival far less certain. And let's not forget, this is a man-made catastrophe. It is entirely preventable. Participating in it or not, allowing it to happen is a choice. This is a deliberate denial of conditions necessary for life: food, shelter, water, and medicine. Preventing genocide means refusing to normalize these atrocities. It means refusing to dehumanize the Palestinians, to refuse to see them as calories counted or numbers of trucks moved. We see now that this way of thinking has brought about a human dignity crisis with an entire people on the edge of survival. On March 18th, the ceasefire was violated by Israel. That day, I witnessed the most extreme mass casualty event of my career at Nasser Medical Complex. 221 trauma patients arrived in one morning. 90 were dead on arrival. Nearly half were severely injured children. No health system on earth could cope with this, least of all one that is besieged and starved of supplies. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries. Healthcare workers and first responders are supposed to be protected. Children are supposed to be protected. In Gaza, these protections are simply gone. Every day, the distinction between combatant and civilian is erased. Most of my patients were pre-teen children, their bodies shattered by explosives and torn by flying metal. Many died. Those who lived often awoke to find their entire families gone. Last year, I published in the New York Times a survey of 65 American healthcare workers who had served in Gaza. 83% of them reported seeing children shot in the head or the chest. I personally treated 13 such cases in my 2 weeks at European Hospital. According to the War Child Alliance, nearly half of Gaza's children are suicidal. They ask, why didn't I die with my sister, my mother, my father? Not out of extremism, but out of unbearable grief. I wonder if any member of this council has ever met a 5-year-old child who no longer wants to live, let alone imagined a society in which so many young children feel this way. And what astonishes me is not that some children in Gaza have lost the will to live, but that any still cling to hope. My Palestinian friends, mostly healthcare workers, no longer speak of resilience or even survival. Parents memorize their children's clothing in case they must identify their remains later. They pray for one piece of bread to give them before they sleep so that their children might die less hungry if they are killed at night. And meanwhile, my Israeli and American friends express horror at what is being done in their names. Many of us cannot understand how our governments continue to arm this senseless destruction, but you in this chamber have the power to stop it. Mr. President, I am here because I have witnessed what is happening in Gaza with my own eyes, especially to children, and I cannot pretend not to have seen it. You too cannot claim ignorance. I urge the Council, and especially my own government, to act with urgency on these enforceable measures. 1. Demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire, including a halt to all arms transfers to all parties to the conflict, alongside targeted and lawful sanctions on Israel. 2. Demand the reopening of all of Gaza's crossings and guarantee unrestricted medical evacuations, including to hospitals in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where Palestinian patients can be treated by Palestinian doctors, with safe return to Gaza assured. 3. Guarantee sustained humanitarian access throughout Gaza, allowing all essential supplies, shelter, food, water, fuel, and medical supplies to reach all people in need. 4. Strongly and explicitly reject the weaponization and politicization of aid embodied by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose executive director, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, publicly resigned on Sunday, citing the foundation's lack of adherence to humanitarian principles. We must affirm support for existing UN mechanisms, back UNRWA, and ensure NGOs with expertise in reaching and providing specialized care to those in need have unimpeded full access. 5. The immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. 6. the immediate and unconditional release of all healthcare workers, including Dr. Hussam Abu Sufia, now held in Israeli detention for more than 150 days. And 7, without delay, uphold the UN Charter and act now to prevent genocide. One day, Gaza survivors may have a record of the empty promises made by the members of this council as their wounds deepened and their lives were lost. If this council remains silent and fails to act now, that record will stand as a testament to a global failure to provide urgent care and to the collapse of our collective conscience. I'm pleading with you to do what you were entrusted to do, to protect international peace and security, and to prevent irreversible harm. The steps I mentioned are the very least that is needed. I'm asking my own government's representative to hear the voices of the majority of Americans who are calling for the same. If this continues, there will be no Palestinian doctors left, no one to care for the sick and wounded. There will be no Palestinians left to rebuild the healthcare system. We are losing a generation before our eyes, condemning people to die of hunger, disease, and despair, deaths that could be easily prevented. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Shitwa for his briefing.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel, get the latest news from Al Jazeera.
And after 30 years of Oslo Accords, the peace accords, what we are having, 1 million citizens in the West Bank, 1 million moved to the West Bank. A new brand of apartheid has been created there. We warned from that in 2001 at the World Conference Against Racism. All world civil society, including the South Africans, said, this is a new brand of apartheid, more bloody and more brutal. On October 7th, in May 7th, last year, Netanyahu launched the attack against Rafah. There was in Rafah and the Mawasi area 1.9 people concentrated in 34 square kilometers. And when we attacked from the east and the north, he wanted to push everybody towards Egypt. That was his final attempt to push Gazans towards Egypt. And he knows Egypt will not shoot at them. But he didn't understand the chemistry of Gaza. Mathematically, all what he did was absolutely right and logical. And the ultimate outcome of that attack was people will go towards Egypt. But 79 of Gazans are refugees. He didn't know these people have the Nakba trauma deep in their heart and mind. And never again. Never again Palestinians will have a new Nakba. They were not instructed by anybody. But that's the hard chemistry of Gaza. And that's why everybody, instead of going south, they just went back north. Now, he's repeating that again by attacking the north, trying to push everybody towards the south, and trying to concentrate them. And I can assure you, I hope this doesn't happen again. But what at this time we are having, we didn't have, the famine on this level. In the last 12 days, hardly anybody in Gaza can have a meal in 4 days or 3 days. I'm talking about women, children, old, young, whatever.
Un momento, conduzco yo.
Once again, with what I began with, we are in a very hard time. We are strong enough to confront this bloody criminal occupation who is doing the genocide at the daylight with intent, declared intent. And it's broadcasted in live stream. But we know we are on the right side of history. We know we are the stones of the valley. We have been there since ever, and we will continue there forever. And we will invest our best to bring dignity, justice for our people. We are entitled for our right of self-determination, and we have no right to be good victims for genociders in the 21st century.
And with the Trump administration, you're seeing just the real forces of finance that have controlled U.S. governments since the aftermath of World War II. The masters of plunder just rear their heads in ways they haven't before and just take on government positions instead of trying to influence empty suits from behind the scenes. That's Steve Feinberg. It's just it's a collection of billionaires advancing the financial priorities of their predatory industry through policy. And Pete Hegseth, that he's just kind of a colorful front man who Trump, I think, believes is somehow charismatic and is way over his head here, way over his head. There was a great exchange, I believe, in Israel with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is one of the fake ministries that Israel has to create because they have to give all of their they have to have so many ministers in order to hold a coalition together. They'll be like, we need the ministry for the Orthodox Party, we need ministry for the Mizrahi Party, Shas, we need the ministry for the Religious Nationalist Party, we need a ministry for the very fascist Religious Nationalist Party, and we need a ministry for the very, very, very fascist Religious Nationalist Party, so they can all have different ministers, and then this will allow us to make Netanyahu king forever. That's how Netanyahu's people do it. So they made up the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. I think it was so like Avigdor Lieberman could be a minister because they needed the Russian vote. So they have this other fake ministry, which now has a spokeswoman. And they had a press conference, and RT dared to ask about the forbidden issue, which our friend Sam Husseini has been basically blacklisted for in the Trump State Department briefing room, Israel's secret nuclear weapons program, its strategic ambiguity, which exempts it from IAEA inspections at the Dimona facility, where it has at least 250 nuclear warheads and has not just the Middle East, but Europe in its crosshairs through the Samson option, which Seymour Hersh revealed in the 1970s. So watch this exchange. This is wild.
Iran cannot have nuclear weapon, and this is what's in front of us. We understand it's not just a threat to Israel, but to the entire world.
What about Israel?
Israel is not posing a threat to anyone. We don't have any ambitions.
Sorry, my whole bit was wrong because this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But they do have a Ministry of Strategic Affairs and a Ministry of Women's Empowerment and all sorts of things. But this is the real Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I actually couldn't believe this was the spokeswoman, so I apologize.
Iran has ambition in the entire Middle East. They are posing a threat and are controlling and have destroyed Lebanon, controlling Lebanon through Hezbollah, destroying its politics, destroying its social fabric, destroying its economy. They did the same thing in Syria. They do the same thing in Iraq. They do the same thing in Yemen, destroying the population, destroying the country, bringing them on the verge of starvation. And this is what they're attempting to do in Jordan. That's what they're doing in Africa. That's what's happening. Who's arming Al-Shabaab? Who's training Al-Shabaab in Somalia right now? What's happening in Central and South America? Hezbollah is the biggest controller of illegal drug and weapon trafficking routes in Central and South America.
Wait, what?
Trump's war on the cartel is not just about the illegal drugs and weapon and the threat of those gangs, but it's the Iranian threat. And so Iran is a threat to the entire world. And Israel is at the front line of stopping the worst enemy the world can. And I don't understand that question.
With all respect, the question was not about Iran. The question was about
Israel's posing a threat on? Israel has never provoked, has never attacked unprovokedly.
Israel is never attacked unprovokedly is like my favorite quote of the year.
Usually these Israeli spokespeople are like native English speakers because they come from Australia or South Africa.
Yeah.
This lady seems to be a rare exception of someone who's not born actually, in a foreign country. So at least she's from Israel, it looks like. But yeah, that makes for funny lines like that. Israel,
yeah, and she looks like she just got out of the shower or is a big Rick James fan.
But I just love. I mean, she has to acknowledge that all of Israel's wars. At least she has to kind of admit tacitly that it's not as if like the standard Israeli narrative is that Israel's always attacked, but actually she's actually saying that we've attacked, but never unprovokedly. So we've always been provoked whenever we attacked, which of course is another lie. But at least she's kind of acknowledging at least that Israel has attacked every single time because actually it does start all of its wars.
They didn't attack unprovokedly in 1967 when they were able to wipe out the much of the Egyptian Air Force because no one was ready for their attack. There was no pretext for it at all.
Yeah. And then they managed to steal all this land that they wanted, which somehow it's such a miracle in a defensive war, supposedly, that you end up stealing all this new territory that you've always wanted. What a miracle.
Unprovokedly.
This has always been on the defense of our country and our people. We have no ambition. When you hear the Ayatollah saying every single day about their ambitions, what about the Turkish ambitions? What about what's happening in Syria? Do you ask those leadership about it?
Well, hasn't Israel just stolen Mount Hermon, the highest point in Syria, and moved close to Damascus's suburbs, extending its occupation?
Well, Israel is...
And Israeli ministers have talked about going to Lebanon too. Sellers have talked about going to Lebanon. So they talk all the time about expanding their ambitions. I mean, they've been talking about that since before 1948. This is their entire history, is just stealing more land.
They have no ambition. They're just like, they're just wasting away in Margaritaville. They're not doing anything.
Israel
this is great.
Is the key for stabilizing the Middle East.
That's almost as good as unprovokedly. Israel is the key for stabilizing the Middle East.
So if Iran abandons its nuclear program, Israel will do the same?
Israel is what's stabilizing the Middle East. Iran is what's
destabilizing,
arming, and terrorizing the entire population around. Do you know what we've been through? Not just the Israeli people, the Lebanese people, the Iranian people, the Yemenite people. The
Yemenite?
On for freedom,
is that their Israeli tribe?
For food,
yeah.
For economical prosperity. And who's preventing that? Iran. This is the greatest enemy the world have during these days. And so this arming Iran is not Israel's interest. It's your interest. It's international community's interest. Try and imagine what is happening right now in the Middle East with with nuclear weapons. It's not just a threat on Israel. It's a threat on the entire world.
Well, that's the Israeli logic, not exactly articulately expressed, but that's the logic. But it's also a way of deflecting from, I think, one of the most important issues that you're not allowed to, it's not even discussed in US media. And I think the US government is unofficially, it feels like they're unofficially banned from even discussing it because of the furor that would erupt, which is Israel's secret nuclear program, which is what is fueling Iran's enrichment program. I mean, it's the reason Iran has to enrich, along with Israeli pressure for an assault, invasion, regime change war. And she reminds me of when Donald Trump in the 2016 debate with Hillary was asked about, his boasting to Billy Bush about grabbing women by the genitals. It was like this leaked audio. And he said, we're going to knock the hell out of ISIS. And he just immediately deflected to knocking the hell out of ISIS. And then just the question, it just moved on and blunted the impact of that issue.
And what did Iran recently propose? They've revived again, which is something they put on the table for decades now, which is a nuclear-free Middle East. Let's have a nuclear-free Middle East. Whenever the UN talks about that, Iran supports it. It's only the U.S. and Israel that refuse to even discuss it, when that would be the solution to everyone's problems. If you're so concerned about, nuclear proliferation, then just ban nuclear weapons in the Middle East. But the U.S. and Israel won't do that because that would take away Israel's ability to threaten everybody with their nukes, which they actually have, unlike Iran, which, if you believe U.S. intelligence, still does not have a nuclear weapons program. Contrary to what many would argue would be in their own best interest. As John Mearsheimer argues, the Middle East would be safer if Iran had nuclear weapons.
India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. That has probably reduced the risk of an India-Pakistan war over Kashmir. However, if a war does occur, it increases the risk of mass destruction. But I think if you look at Israel, the mentality of its citizens, embodied by the foreign ministry spokeswoman, who is clearly just off her rocker, very aggressive and warlike. The instability of Israeli politics. I think the greatest threat for a nuclear strike in the world right now emanates from Israel. And of course, there's no inspection. There's no inspection allowed at Dimona. I think every reporter who goes to the State Department who has any spine or brain at all has to do what Sam Husseini does and did. And, if I decide to go back there, I have to do a bunch of paperwork. What I would just say is, does any country in the Middle East currently have nuclear weapons? I remember Helen Thomas used to ask that question. And you'll see that the spokeswoman will not have an answer and refuse to answer. She called Tammy Bruce, she called Sam Husseini a conspiracy theorist for daring to bring up Israeli nuclear weapons. But you're doing it so the American public can see that there's something deeply wrong there. There's a major contradiction in our policy, and that only Israel has been granted this exemption. I guess because of the Holocaust. And it's the one key to, I think, ending this crisis. If I were campaigning for office, I would campaign for a nuclear-free Middle East. But I'm not going to campaign for office. Somehow it wouldn't the bullet wouldn't just hit my ear.
One thing I want to say is this, is that I know the idea of a Palestinian state is not very popular among leftist circles, because it would mean accepting the existence of this apartheid colony that stole their land. But on that issue, Iran has a far more accommodating position than Israel or the U.S. does. Iran has said before that they would accept a Palestinian state, especially if Palestinians approved of it in a popular referendum. So it's only Israel and the U.S. that stand apart and insisting on Israel's right to take over all the Palestinian and a wider regional land that it wants. And it's Iran that supported the compromise that the rest of the world supports. So, and I think, one of the reasons why Israel wants regime change in Iran is it doesn't want to have any possible actor in the region that can help impose the consensus that it's been trying to undermine. It wants the right to basically crush Palestinian self-determination. And because Iran has supported resistance factions like Hamas, that's why it has to go, because it stands in the way of Israel being able to steal as much land as it wants. And Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, he recently gave an interview where he acknowledged that Hamas's demands are simply that they wanted Israel, on top of releasing political prisoners, to withdraw from the occupied territories, including the West Bank. And therefore, Hamas, along with Israeli captives inside Gaza, had to be destroyed. This is Yoav Gallant.
I'm fighting Hamas since it was established in '87, and I know them quite good. And I knew that they will not give you anything unless you have something that they really need. And this is not the prisoners. The prisoners in Israel...
Meaning the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons.
The Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons was already given. They were speaking about Israel withdrawing from Judea and Samaria. They were speaking about how to divide Jerusalem in their thinking. So
Judea and Samaria, that means the West Bank. So Hamas was speaking about Israel withdrawing from Judea and Samaria, which is Israel's term for its settler colonies in the West Bank, and also how to divide Jerusalem, which is giving East Jerusalem to Palestinians, which again, that's supposed to be the compromise that most of the world supports and the U.S. once claimed to support. But Israel won't even accept a Palestinian compromise because they want to hold on to that land in the occupied West Bank. And so Yoav Gallant is saying there that that's what Hamas's motive was in launching October 7th. It wasn't just getting prisoners, political prisoners freed. It was also getting Israel to end its occupation. Israel won't do that. So therefore, we have to be in this perpetual war with everybody.
Well, it's also ascribing logical motives to what Hamas did when we were told it was just about sheer savagery, killing Jews and strangling babies.
Yeah.
Now they tell us. There's a major spread in the Financial Times from last weekend, I believe, about Netanyahu's next move. An emboldened Netanyahu makes its next move. And Ami Ayalon, who is the former director of the Shin Bet, says that by late spring 2024, the war on Gaza had achieved all military objectives possible. There's nothing else it could achieve, and that everything that has happened since then has been purely political. In other words, all the slaughter that we're continuing to witness is political because Netanyahu will lose his coalition, may go to prison for corruption trials, and needs to keep the war going for as long as possible. And now the Trump administration, following the lead of Tony Blinken and Biden, are assisting. But Ayalon, in his assessment, said Biden was a Zionist. Biden actually had ideological motives. Trump does not. And Trump is being purely opportunistic there, which is interesting. It's just transactional politics. You have going back to the lobby documentary, the hidden camera documentary that Al Jazeera refused to publish. Adam Milstein, some of his staffers at Israel lobby groups like the Israel Project and elsewhere declared that they would get on the phone with Trump and his people, and Trump would say, "Send me more money. I need more money from Adam Milstein. What do you want me to do?" And it was just like that. It's all on camera. So there's an Israeli investigative report that emerged this week. I don't have the photo in front of me. There's no real point. Netanyahu deployed a photo of what he said was a tunnel in the Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and Gaza after achieving all military objectives in Gaza that they thought they needed to achieve by the spring. In order to keep Israel bogged down there, he said, we need to occupy the Philadelphia corridor, and here is a giant tunnel that we've just discovered that a Jeep can drive through. It turned out the Israeli military had built a trench around the Jeep out of dirt that resembled a tunnel, and there was no tunnel. It was completely imaginary, and it was front and center in Netanyahu's presentation, along with phony leaks disseminated through the German tabloid Bild and I believe Jewish Insider here in Washington from Netanyahu's team, claiming that Yahya Sinwar had a plan to escape into Egypt along with several hostages unless Israel occupied the Philadelphia corridor. And now they're demanding to occupy the Philadelphia corridor again. They're still doing it. It's still happening now, and so many people are being slaughtered. West Gaza is being heavily bombarded as we speak. I mean, just go follow any Twitter account from Gaza City, and you will see the torment that they're going through for this political war.
The Israeli Defense Force, Israel's well-funded and high-tech army, is the most moral army in the world. That is, if you believe the branding.
צה"ל הוא הצבא המוסרי ביותר בעולם.
The most moral army in the world.
The IDF is a moral army. The most moral. The moralist.
The IDF does more to safeguard the rights of civilians than any other army in the history of warfare.
But apart from the allegations of war crimes in Gaza, the attempts to paint it as an animal-friendly, queer-friendly, religiously tolerant military institution, the history of the IDF says more about it than its social media image. Before the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, and before there was an Israeli army, there were three underground Zionist militias: the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi. They were comprised of mainly Jewish migrants to the British Mandate of Palestine, with the aim of helping usher in the Jewish state by any means necessary. They differed in their tactics and beliefs, and at times fought with each other, but together they terrorized Palestinian villages, committed acts of violence, terrorism, and ethnic cleansing, and executed bombings and assassinations against the British to force them to give up control of the land. They blew up hotels in Jerusalem, embassies in Europe, and assassinated a UN mediator. All of this happened before 1948, because after Israel was officiated as a state, these three groups would be brought together to create the IDF, and their militia leaders would go on to form Israel's government, become politicians, ambassadors, and prime ministers. And their dark history would be forgotten. So, let's talk about it. Let's begin at the turn of the 20th century. Europe was embroiled in revolution, war, and great social upheaval. Anti-Semitism had been rife for centuries in Europe, but attacks against Jewish communities had become widespread, particularly in Russia. While most attempted to flee to the United States, around 30,000 Russian Jews migrated to Palestine from 1882 to 1904, then under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. These communities were known as the New Yeshuv, and they built small self-reliant settlements independent of the Old Yeshuv, who consisted mostly of Arab Jews who'd migrated to Jerusalem over centuries, mostly for religious practice. Unlike the Old Yeshuv, the New Yeshuv were driven by a new ideology that was growing popular among European Jews as well as some influential Christian figures: Zionism.
And the basis of Zionism was the belief that the Jewish question, as it was called in Europe, in other words, a place of Jews, given the rising anti-Semitism, could only be solved territorially, that is, by establishing a state of their own. And from very early on, that state had to be in Palestine, because that way you could use religious legitimacy to justify what was settler colonialism.
The New Yeshuv were ambitious. They built farms, formed trade unions and councils to purchase land from Palestinians. They also began to form small militias, seeking to replace hired Arab watchmen with Jewish guards to protect the new outposts. Some of these militias, like Bar Giora, had bigger plans. Its members wanted to create the beginnings of an underground army, one that would one day serve a future Jewish state, and fight for one if need be. One of its founders was a young Polish laborer called David Groom, who migrated to Palestine in 1906. He was shocked at how many Palestinian Arabs worked in the new settler colonies as farmers and guards, and set about trying to build connections between migrants and fundraise to ensure the Yishuv would become completely self-reliant. This included more money to buy weapons. Like many other Jewish migrants, he later adopted a Hebrew last name and would hence be known as David Ben-Gurion. We'll come back to him. By 1909, militias like Bar Giora began to evolve into larger networks, the most prominent being Hashimer, or the Watchman. Despite only having a few dozen members, Hashimer began to think of itself as guarding not only the colonies and properties set up by the new Yishuv, but as a vigilante force that would respond to disputes. If a Jewish person was attacked by a Palestinian, Hashimer would send its armed members to seek revenge. They were inspired by Ukrainian Cossacks and, interestingly, Palestinian Bedouins. They rode on horseback and even dressed in kufiyas. Weird, right? In his book Orientalism and the Hebrew Imagination, historian Yaron Peleg says the young Zionists wanted to recreate the image of the Jewish man and reject the anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as weak and passive. In the new Yishuv, they focused on farming and fighting as ways to build stronger, more self-reliant men, what Zionist leader Max Nordau described as muscular Judaism. And while they drew inspiration from the agricultural Arabs they saw around them, they no longer wanted to rely on Palestinian laborers and guards in their settlements. The Jewish state of the future had to rely on a Jewish workforce, and eventually a Jewish army. At this point, the total Jewish population of Palestine was around 60,000 and accounted for only about 7% of the population, with many of the earlier Russian migrants going back home once the situation had eased. But by the end of World War I, everything had changed. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Palestine was taken over by the British Army. Lord Arthur Balfour, himself a Christian Zionist and Foreign Secretary, signed the Balfour Declaration, promising to create a Jewish state in mandatory Palestine. This led to a bigger wave of migration to the new Yishuv, and up to 100,000 Jewish migrants arrived from Eastern Europe in the decade following the war. By now, the local Palestinian Arab population were starting to feel like something was amiss. Were outraged at the Balfour Declaration, and many of them saw it as a European plot to colonize Arab land. House purchases in Jerusalem and Hebron were increasing, as were the construction of Jewish kibbutzes and settlements. But what pushed tensions to the brink was the increased religious activity around the Western Wall and Al-Aqsa compound, which some radical voices were arguing should be under total Jewish control. This spilled over into riots and general strikes targeting British and Jewish outposts, which escalated into communal fighting in 1920 and 1921. For the Zionist leaders, it proved that the local paramilitary groups needed to be better organized and better equipped to protect the new Yishuv. This led to the establishment of the Haganah, or the Defense, which formed from the Hashimer recruits, as well as an influx of soldiers who had served in Jewish regiments in the British Army during World War I. They smuggled in more advanced weapons from abroad, and by the 1930s, the majority of Jewish settlers were enlisted, and the paramilitary group became the foundation of the new Yishuv. The Haganah now resembled what the Bar Giora had once dreamt up, an underground army fighting for the promise of a Jewish state. Initially, they coordinated and at times fought alongside the British against Palestinian Arab rioters in small skirmishes. The worst of these happened in 1929, when a rumor spread to Hebron that 2 Palestinians had been killed in the holy city of Jerusalem, and that a plot was underway to take Al-Aqsa. A riot ensued, targeting Jewish homes and synagogues. There were only 700 Jews in Hebron at the time, and many were sheltered by Palestinian families until the fighting ended, but by that time at least 50 Jewish settlers had been killed. The militants began to feel that the small British military presence was reluctant to fight the Palestinians, and resentment began to grow within their ranks. Some still looked to the British for protection, but others saw them as merely an obstacle to statehood that needed to move out of the way by force if necessary. Remember David Ben-Gurion? He'd now become the de facto leader of the new Yishuv as the president of the Jewish Agency, working with the British to protect Jewish interests and to shut down calls for unity with Palestinians. But Ben-Gurion didn't want to confront the Arabs head-on, not at this stage at least. He also didn't want to create problems with his British allies and instituted a policy of Havlaga, restraint. Under his watch, the Haganah forces would only be deployed to protect Jewish settlements, not launch offenses against Palestinian villages. At least, not for another few years. In a letter he would later write to his son in 1937, Ben-Gurion made his intentions pretty clear. Quote, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places. And if we have to use force, not to dispossess the Arabs of the Negev and the Transjordan, but to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal." Ben-Gurion's focus was back on Europe, where the tides of anti-Semitism were rising to unprecedented levels. With the emergence of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, it became clear that more efforts were needed to transfer as many Jews to Palestine as possible. Over the next decade, 250,000 European Jews would flee to Palestine, pushing existing tensions to a boiling point. The divisions within the Haganah were growing as well, between those who followed Ben-Gurion's lead and another group of revisionist Zionists, who not only felt that the British were getting in the way of the dream of creating a greater Israel over the whole of the Mandate of Palestine, but who also believed that this greater Israel should extend to all of Jordan and parts of Lebanon and Syria. But to make this dream a reality, they needed to put an end to Palestinian resistance on their own terms, without waiting for orders from the British or even Ben-Gurion, whose policy of restraint failed to convince the most hardline young Zionists. So they took matters into their own hands, splintering from the Haganah and formed their own paramilitary group, the Irgun. The Irgun was led by a number of defected Haganah senior commanders, including, most significantly, the writer Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the founder of revisionist Zionism and had been active in Jewish defense efforts in the Russian Federation before going on to found one of the Jewish regiments in the British Army with the aim of fighting against the Ottomans in Palestine. In a paper he published in 1923 entitled The Iron Wall, Jabotinsky outlined his fundamental disagreements with Ben-Gurion and the other moderate Zionists, who he called vegetarians and peacemongers. Quote, "Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools whom we can deceive by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon to us their claim to priority in Palestine. We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them more palatable, but they know what we want." Jabotinsky believed that all native populations resist colonists, and that the only way to deal with them was by creating an iron wall of force that couldn't be penetrated. With his ideas, the new militia began to grow from dozens to thousands, with an emblem that represented their ambitions to expand to all of historic Palestine as well as Transjordan. They initially fought strategically alongside the Haganah and the British, but that would change in 1936, when a Palestinian uprising would push them to take matters into their own hands.
Unrest in Palestine. Suspecting that the Higher Committee had incited Arab leaders to start a holy war against the British government, police swooped on the secret headquarters of assassins and rebels. Many arrests were made.
It was called the Great Revolt. Furious at Britain's support for Zionism, the growing population of armed settlers, and the crippling economic impacts of the Great Depression, the Palestinians attempted to overthrow British occupation, and with it, end the attempts of dividing their land. It began with a series of general strikes from mostly farmers, but soon the rebellion began to take structure, with armed rebels forming platoons and appointing leaders. But they were up against 2 British regiments, making up around 20,000 soldiers, as well as an armed and trained Jewish Guard force and Haganah and Irgun forces that together made up tens of thousands of armed militiamen. In short, they were